station stop will be Woodstock in approximately 10 minutes. For your safety, please remain seated until the train comes to complete stop at the station. Once again, Woodstock is next.
The Train Stalker. It was late, and I was on the last train home after a long day in the city. The carriage was almost empty, with only a few passengers scattered around, each lost in their own world. I was exhausted, my mind foggy from work, and I just wanted to get home and collapse into bed. The rhythmic clatter of the train tracks was almost soothing, and I found myself staring blankly out the window, the darkness outside making it impossible to see anything but my own reflection. We were about halfway through the journey when I noticed him. He was sitting several rows behind me, a man in his late 30s or early 40s wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another passenger. But then I felt it, the unsettling sensation of being watched. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the feeling, but it persisted. I glanced around casually, and that's when I caught him staring directly at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and something about his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. I looked away quickly, hoping he would lose interest. But he didn't. Every time I sneaked a glance in his direction, he was still staring, unblinking, as if I were the only other person on the train. My heart began to race, and a creeping sense of dread settled in. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that he was probably just tired and zoning out like everyone else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The train pulled into the next station, and a few more passengers got off, leaving the carriage even emptier. I thought about switching to another car, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I pulled out my phone, pretending to text someone while keeping him in my peripheral vision. To my horror, I saw him stand up. He walked slowly down the aisle, passing empty seats, until he was directly across from me. He sat down, too close for comfort, his eyes never leaving my face. I could feel his stare burning into me, and my skin crawled. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. My mind raced through possible scenarios, trying to figure out what to do. Should I move? Should I confront him? But what if that only made things worse? The train slowed as we approached another station, and I made a snap decision. As soon as the doors opened, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I sprinted down the platform, not daring to look back. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. But as I reached the stairs leading out of the station, I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him. He was following me, moving quickly, his expression focused and determined. Panic surged through me, and I ran faster, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. I burst out onto the street, frantically looking for anyone who might help, but the area was eerily deserted. The streets were dark, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt like a deer being hunted. I spotted a taxi idling at a nearby corner and dashed towards it, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the door shut just as the man emerged from the station. He stopped, his eyes locking onto mine through the window. For a moment, I thought he was going to try and force his way in, but instead he just stood there staring at me with that same cold, unnerving gaze. "Go! Please, just go!" I gasped to the driver, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. He didn't need to be told twice. The taxi sped off, leaving the man standing alone on the darkened street. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see him chasing after us. But he was gone, swallowed up by the night. My pulse was still racing, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. The fear lingered, making it hard to fall asleep, and even harder to shake the feeling that he might still be out there, watching, waiting. I don't take the train late at night anymore, and I'm always careful now, always aware of my surroundings. Because I'll never forget the feeling of those cold, calculating eyes staring at me, or the way my heart pounded as I ran for my life. I was lucky to escape that night, but I know others might not be so fortunate. The eerie encounter. Last winter, I had to take a late-night train back to London after a work trip. The station was nearly deserted, with only a few tired travelers waiting for the same train. The cold air bit at my face as I waited on the platform, fog swirling around my feet. It was the kind of night that made everything seem just a little bit off. When the train finally arrived, I boarded and found the carriage mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I chose a seat by the window and settled in, eager to relax during the long ride. The train rattled out of the station, and I let out a small sigh of relief, glad to be on my way home. A few stops later, I noticed an elderly woman boarding the train. She shuffled slowly, her small frame hunched over, clutching a large, worn handbag that looked as old as she was. Her clothes were outdated, layers of heavy woolen garments that seemed more suited for a time long past. What struck me most was her face, deeply lined and gaunt, with eyes that were strangely vacant, yet piercing. To my surprise, she made her way directly toward me, even though the carriage was nearly empty. She sat down right next to me, her bony hands clutching her bag tightly on her lap. I tried to ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine, convincing myself that she was just an old lady who preferred company. The train continued its journey, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks filling the silence. I glanced over at the old woman, trying to be polite, but something about her made my skin crawl. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, and her lips moved silently, as if she was muttering to herself. I couldn't make out what she was saying, and I didn't dare ask. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, when she suddenly turned to me, her cold eyes locking onto mine. She leaned in closer, the musty scent of mothballs and old fabric wafting from her clothes. Then, in a low, raspy voice, she said, "They don't like it when you sit alone." A chill ran down my spine. I forced a nervous smile, unsure of how to respond. "Who doesn't like it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer, just kept staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. Her grip on her handbag tightened, her knuckles turning white. I felt trapped, the weight of her presence pressing down on me. The train passed through a tunnel, plunging the carriage into darkness. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment I swore I saw something move in the reflection of the window, a shadowy figure standing behind us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly looked around, but there was no one there. Just the two of us, and the faint light of the train flickering back to life. The old woman's muttering grew louder, more urgent, but the words were still incomprehensible. I wanted to move, to switch seats, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was as if I was frozen in place, held there by some invisible force. Then, she leaned in even closer, her breath cold against my ear. "They're watching us," she whispered. "They don't like it when we know." I felt a surge of fear, the kind that makes your hands tremble and your mind race. I stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing to use the restroom, and hurried down the aisle away from her. As I passed through the next carriage, I looked back, expecting to see her staring after me. But she was gone. The seat where she had been sitting was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Confused and unsettled, I wandered back to my original seat. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that the old woman's handbag was still there, lying on the seat where she had sat. I hesitated, my curiosity battling with the dread gnawing at my insides. Finally, unable to resist, I reached out and cautiously opened the bag. Inside, I found nothing but old, yellowed newspaper clippings, all of them about missing persons, people who had disappeared on late-night trains over the years. My hands trembled as I read the headlines, each one more chilling than the last. And then I saw it. A faded, black and white photograph of the old woman herself, along with a headline that read, "Mysterious Disappearances Linked to Elderly Passenger." The date on the article was over 40 years old. A wave of nausea hit me as I dropped the handbag and backed away. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. I wanted to run, to get off that train as soon as possible, but there was nowhere to go. The train was moving at full speed, hurtling through the night with no sign of stopping. I sat down again, my thoughts spinning. The train passed through another tunnel, and when we emerged, I noticed something even more disturbing. The carriage was completely empty. All the passengers who had been there before were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Terrified, I stared out the window, trying to focus on the passing scenery, but all I could see was darkness. The train felt like it was moving faster, the wheels clattering louder and louder. And then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw her, the old woman standing right behind me, her eyes filled with something I can only describe as malice. She leaned in close once more, her voice a haunting whisper in my ear. "They don't like it when you're alone." The lights flickered and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was still on the train, but it was daylight, and we were pulling into my stop. The carriage was full of people, all going about their business as if nothing had happened. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of the old woman, no handbag, nothing out of the ordinary. I stumbled off the train, my heart still racing, and vowed never to take a late-night train again. But even now, whenever I pass that station, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again, watching, waiting. Because deep down, I know she's still out there, somewhere, looking for her next passenger. The last carriage. Last autumn, I had to take a late-night train to visit a friend who lived in a small, secluded town. The journey was long, and the night had already settled in by the time I boarded the train. The station was almost deserted, with only a few passengers milling about. The air was chilly, and a dense fog clung to the ground, giving the whole scene an eerie, otherworldly feel. Once on board, I noticed that the train was nearly empty. A few people were scattered across the dimly lit carriages, their faces obscured by shadows and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. I found a seat near the back, close to the last carriage, hoping for some peace and quiet. As the train rumbled out of the station, I let my thoughts drift, gazing out at the passing landscape. The towns and fields soon gave way to dense forests, the trees looking like dark, twisted silhouettes against the night sky. The train sped through the darkness, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks becoming almost hypnotic. After a while, I began to notice something strange. The last carriage, which was visible through the narrow connecting door, was completely unlit. It looked different from the rest of the train, older, more worn down, like it had been forgotten by time. The windows were grimy, and the door to the carriage was slightly ajar, creaking with every turn the train took. Curiosity gnawed at me. Why was this carriage so different? Why was it in such a state of disrepair when the rest of the train seemed fine? My imagination ran wild with possibilities. Stories of abandoned carriages, forgotten passengers, and ghostly encounters. When the conductor came by to check tickets, I decided to ask him about it. He was an older man, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes that seemed to have seen too much. I caught his attention as he passed by my seat. "Excuse me," I began, nodding toward the last carriage. "What's the deal with that carriage back there? Why is it so neglected?" His expression changed instantly. The weariness in his eyes was replaced with a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe? He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the darkened carriage before leaning in closer. "That carriage hasn't been in use for years," he said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "It's locked up for a reason. Best you don't go near it." His words sent a chill down my spine, but they only fueled my curiosity. I should have let it go, but something about the way he spoke, the way his voice wavered ever so slightly, made me want to know more. The train continued on, the journey stretching into the late hours of the night. Outside, the landscape grew more desolate, the trees thinning out until there was nothing but open, barren land. The fog thickened, pressing against the windows like ghostly hands. We made a brief stop at a small, isolated station, nothing more than a platform and a flickering light. No one got on, and no one got off. The station was completely deserted, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. It was then that I decided to investigate the last carriage. The door to the darkened carriage was slightly ajar, just as I had noticed earlier. With the conductor nowhere in sight, I seized the opportunity. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Immediately, the air turned cold. Unnaturally so. A damp, musty smell filled my nostrils like the scent of something that had been left to rot in the dark. The interior of the carriage was even worse than I had imagined. The seats were torn, with stuffing spilling out like entrails. The walls were stained and cracked, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for who knows how long. As I moved further into the carriage, the lights in the main train flickered and dimmed, leaving me in near total darkness. I could barely make out the shapes of the seats and windows. The silence was deafening, the only sound the distant clatter of the train on the tracks. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from the very walls of the carriage, wrapping around me like a cold breeze. The whisper grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their tones laced with fear and despair. I turned to leave, but the door had somehow closed behind me. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest as I pounded on the door, but it was as if the rest of the train didn't exist anymore, as if I had been cut off from the world. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadowy figure was slowly making its way down the aisle, coming from the far end of the carriage. My heart raced as the figure grew closer, its form dark and indistinct, like a living shadow. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were warning me, begging me to leave. But I was trapped, with no way out. Just as the shadow was about to reach me, the train lurched to a sudden stop. The door behind me flew open, and I stumbled out into the connecting carriage, gasping for air. The lights flickered back on, and the whispers ceased, leaving me in stunned silence. The conductor was standing there, his face pale and drawn. He quickly locked the door to the last carriage, his hands shaking. "I warned you," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "That's where they keep the souls of those who died on this train. They say they can't rest, and they wait for someone foolish enough to join them." I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried back to my seat, my heart still pounding in my chest. The rest of the journey passed in a blur, my eyes fixed on the floor, too afraid to look back at the last carriage. When we finally arrived at my stop, I practically ran off the train, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that cursed carriage as possible. I never took that train again, and I avoided late-night journeys altogether. But even now, whenever I pass by those tracks, I can't shake the feeling that the whispers are still there, echoing in the dark, waiting for the next unsuspecting passenger to board the last carriage.
Your attention, please. Our next station stop will be Woodstock in approximately 10 minutes. For your safety, please remain seated until the train comes to stop at the station. Once again, Woodstock is next.